Well, back in the 1950s, while the Corvette may have been winning on racetracks, it was the Ford Thunderbird that was winning where it mattered, on the showroom floor. They were selling far more Thunderbirds than they were ever selling Corvettes back in the mid-50s. Hi there, I'm Rick DeBrule with another Collector Car Profile. Once again here at the Martin Auto Museum, an amazing collection of more than 170 cars here in Phoenix, and it spans the full spectrum. Everything from, well, an 1886 Benz to a 2020 Corvette C8. The full automotive spectrum right here in Phoenix. It's a must-see place if you're a car person. Now, let's get back to this Ford Thunderbird. A lot of people just assume that this was a result of a battle between Ford and Chevrolet trying to come up with, well, another Corvette. But really, the genesis of this car goes back to before the Corvette ever existed. It's 1951. As legend has it, there were two Ford executives who were in Paris walking along. They saw some of the sporty-looking cars, and one of the execs, the higher-up guy, says to the other exec, well, gosh, I wish we had something like that. And the other guy said, well, you know what, we have something in the works. Well, it turns out they didn't have anything in the works, but he immediately got back on the phone to the United States and said, hey, I need you to draw up some two-seater sporty-looking cars so that when we get back, we have something to present. And that's exactly what they did. A couple years later, 1953, they finally get the green light to go ahead with the project. And in 1954, this is what debuts. Now, the concept of what they were supposed to come up with was actually pretty simple. They really weren't coming up with a sports car in its purest sense. What they were coming up with in their concept for it was what they called a personal car. It wasn't supposed to be, well, like a Corvette, fiberglass, very sporty. It was supposed to be a little more comfortable than that. And they had certain important parameters that they had to work within. They had to use a lot of existing Ford parts. They had to try to keep it within about 2,500 pounds. I can tell you they didn't achieve that goal. And they also had to use a V8 engine because that's what they had available to them and that's what they wanted to put for performance into this particular car. The reality is, on just about every front, they pretty much nailed what they were trying to achieve. And that's why when this debuted back in 1954, when it first hit the showrooms in late 1954, they took 3,500 orders within the first 10 days. They were only thinking they were going to build 10,000 of them that first year. They ended up building 16,000 Thunderbirds in the very first year in 1955. How many Corvettes were sold that same year? Yes, 700. Not nearly enough. And once again, this car came with a V8 as the standard engine. Up until that point, you could only get a six-cylinder engine in the Corvette. Now, the V8 debuted in 1955, but people still had that taste of the six-cylinder Corvette, and they thought, well, this has a V8 engine underneath the hood, that 292 cubic inch Interceptor. Base horsepower on this was 193 horsepower. If you got the automatic, you actually got 198 horsepower. So from a looks perspective, they pretty much nailed it. From a performance perspective, they pretty much nailed it. And from a price perspective, it was right where it needed to be. So this was the perfect answer to what America wanted at that moment in time. So how did they come up with the name for the Thunderbird? Well, that's actually a pretty cool story. They went through literally thousands of names, all kind of things like, well, the Seville, the Hepcat. They were trying to come up with something creative, but they ultimately ended up deciding to have a contest within Ford. People were able to submit names. One particular person who worked for Ford submitted a name because he had grown up in the Southwest. Thunderbird. You know, that is the mythical bird that was responsible for creating both wind and lightning. It also was responsible for providing the rains that were able to grow vegetation on the arid lands. It was just kind of a cool name, and they accepted it. Now, the fun thing was there was supposed to be a prize. The prize, it was a $250 suit, which you think about it, back in the early 50s, that was a pretty valuable suit. Turns out the guy who ultimately submitted the name and won the contest, well, he didn't want the suit, but he did take a pair of pants. Where the Corvette didn't look like any other Chevrolet product, the goal from the beginning was to have the Thunderbird look similar to everything else that was in the Ford line. Once again, they had to use some of the parts that other Fords were using, but they also wanted that style to go across. If you look at these headlights, kind of the French-in headlight look, you'll see that on the 1955 Fords. However, they wanted this particular look for the grille. It was that Ferrari-ish kind of style with that egg crate look. It was a great design, and the concept made it look like a Ford. You immediately accept it as a Ford, but at the same time look cool and just a little bit different, significantly smaller than all the other Fords. Underneath the hood, the V8 engine delivered plenty of horsepower. Remember, 193 to 198. And while that may not seem like a lot today, you got to remember back in the 1950s, it was pretty substantial. And remember that the Corvette in 53 and 54 just had that blue flame 6-cylinder engine. So this was a significant step forward. Now, there are people who will argue that the 1955 V8 Chevrolet that came out, that motor, was probably better in many ways than the Ford Interceptor, the 292 cubic inch engine you see right here. Having said that, this is a pretty solid engine for its day, and it delivered plenty of horsepower, and it delivered enough performance, so it did exactly what they wanted it to do. Underneath the hood, you had the 292 cubic inch V8 engine, 4-barrel carburetor, dual exhaust, 6-volt electrical system, and it was mated to a 3-speed manual transmission with a floor shift. However, for an extra $215, you could get the Ford-O-Matic automatic transmission. Interesting little tidbit, you see this air cleaner right here. Notice how it bulges up. Well, when you see the hood scoop, which by the way is functioning, air can't actually come in, well, this scoop actually does 2 functions. The first is to let air in. The second is to provide just enough of bulge so that the air cleaner could fit properly underneath it. Pretty creative with the way they came up with that. Now, as I mentioned, this was not designed to be a racing car, a true sports car. This was a personal car, a car you would want to cruise with. And as such, Ford did not go factory racing with these back in the 1950s. There were a number of people who actually took them drag racing, but very few people actually took them and went road racing with them. But it did the very first year in the hands of a privateer, somebody who was not connected with Ford, did win its class in the Daytona Speed Weeks back in 1955. So that V8 engine under the hood did its job. And once again, the look and the style, it was pretty cool. It looked very, very sporty. Now, one of the cool things about this car is because it sat so low and the hood itself was very low, you actually, while you were driving it, got a great view out the front. It actually helped you to drive. Now, there was a little bit of a problem in the sense that because of this curved windshield, you got a little bit of distortion at the side, but that was actually fairly minor. The biggest problem they had in 1955 was the fact that once they got the top on this thing, they realized there were 2 particular issues. One was there was no airflow in here. It was all buttoned up. They didn't have a good way to bring air into it. And so as a result, for the 1956 model, they had to create a small flap on the side of the car to allow air in. The other problem was with the hardtop on it had a blind spot right about here. And you'll notice that in later Thunderbirds, there's a really nice porthole in the top. There's a reason for that, because that helped the drivers to be able to see while they were cruising around in their personal luxury car. In the 1950s, everything was about the space age, and when you look at the back of this car, it's absolutely that way. I mean, look at these, they used to call these the bullet tail lights, and you can see why. It look like they're rocket engines. And of course, these things right here, exhaust. This is truly the exhaust for the engine. I love the styling of that. No pipes just kind of hanging out underneath. I love the way they've incorporated it into the back of the car. Now, the only downside is sometimes over time, this would corrode because of all the exhaust gases coming out. If you kept it clean, it wasn't a problem. If you didn't, well, then you did have a problem. But once again, look at the fin, the bullet lights, the exhaust, everything is perfect. Now, there was one minor design flaw that had to do with this particular trunk right here. And that's the fact that inside there is a spare tire, because of course that's where you would put it. But the problem is once you put the spare tire in there, there really wasn't a lot of room. So for 1956, as you can see over my shoulder, they came up with what they called, well, it's a Continental kit, the spare tire hanging off the back. Now, the only problem with that one is they discovered it made the car very tail heavy. In 1957, they just came up with a longer trunk to be able to put that in. But in this year, once again, the spare tire is in there. It's a cleaner, purer look. But if you wanted to store a lot of stuff, suitcases, whatever it may be, in the back of your car, well, this didn't have a lot of room. While it's natural to make comparisons with the Corvette and the Thunderbird, the reality is they were different cars designed for different purposes. The Corvette, from the word go, was supposed to be a sports car. They wanted to go racing with it. They wanted it to be something that could corner very well. This car, it was designed to be a personal luxury car, a personal car that you could enjoy in style on the road. They really didn't care what happened in the racing world. The Corvette, well, it has a fiberglass body. This thing, all metal. The chassis underneath the Corvette, designed just for the Corvette. This, well, they'd taken some of the existing Ford chassis and reworked them to put them into this particular situation. But there is one interesting comparison that I don't think is accidental from 1955. The base price for a Thunderbird in 1955 was just under $2,700, like $2,695 for the absolute base price. The cheapest that you could get a Corvette that year, well, it was about $2,774, something like that. They intentionally made sure that this car slotted in just a little bit cheaper than the Corvette. How did they do that? Well, once again, they were using existing parts out of the Ford parts bin, from headlights to taillights, other things, so they didn't have to come up with their own new parts, so they were able to keep the cost down when they were designing this Thunderbird. The evolution of the Thunderbird is actually pretty interesting when you look at it over the years, starting off as what we call the Baby Bird, the shorter two-seater version, then evolving into the really much more popular four-seater. Went all the way through the 60s with that, and then in 1967 they came out with what they called the Landau version, a much more luxurious, shall we say, Thunderbird. It was really appealed to go upscale even more. And it actually sold pretty well. Some of the purists today, well, most prefer the Baby Birds or at least the early 60 Birds. Then as you go along, it evolves even more, kind of becomes, a sister to the Lincoln Continental for a period of time. Then it downsizes again. And in fact, there's a very popular version during the 90s that was being raced in NASCAR. It was a very aerodynamic shape. Then the Thunderbird went away, and for a brief time it came back as a Baby Bird. That's right, the very last generation, I think it was the 11th generation of the Baby Bird, came back as a retro-styled Thunderbird. Unfortunately, it turned out it really wasn't that popular at the time, and they had some engine problems that they had to deal with as well. But it's interesting to think that when it came time to come back with one body style to touch the roots of Thunderbird, this is the body style that they came back to, because ultimately, this is truly a collector classic. Well, this, what we call the Baby Bird styling, ultimately proved to be the most popular for a long, long time. The reality is, even when this car was delivered, its day was numbered. That's because what they discovered at Ford was that the people who were buying these cars also had kids. And if they had kids, that meant they wanted a back seat. So even when this was already on the showroom floors in 1955, they were already working on the 1958 Thunderbird, which would evolve into a four-seater and sell significantly better than the two-seater cars. But having said that, the two-seater, this particular Baby Bird, it sold very well, massively outselling the Corvette, establishing firmly this market for Ford back in the 1950s. So the Baby Bird's truly a collector car classic.